In my era, you were much more, the car and driver were much more as one. You take the car, whatever car it was, and then you modify it to the way you wanted it to handle. You want more oversteer, more understeer, or steering ratio change, all those things you could do and make it the way you wanted it to be. So in other words, you personalize, after all these years, people still ask me about the same things. Why didn't I win the World Championship? Which victory meant the most? Which car was the best I ever drove? And of course they always want to know about the great races, the Nürburgring, Monaco, Aintree, all of that. But there's another question I've been asked from time to time, and it's a much harder one to answer. Who were the 5 greatest Formula One drivers I ever raced against? Now, I don't mean the 5 men with the most championships. I don't even mean the 5 who were simply the fastest, because racing is more complicated than that. Some drivers could produce one extraordinary lap, others could control an entire Grand Prix without ever looking spectacular. And then there were men who made you think differently behind the wheel. Men who forced you to be more precise, more patient, sometimes more courageous than you thought you could be. I was fortunate enough to race in an era filled with remarkable drivers. Some became champions. Some never had the machinery they deserved. But the 5 I remember most clearly all had one thing in common. When I saw them in my mirrors, I knew I could not afford to relax. Let me start with Jim Clark. Jim came along when I was already well established, and I remember watching him and realizing very quickly that this young Scotsman was going to be a serious problem for everybody. He wasn't loud about it. He didn't have to be. There was something remarkably natural about the way he drove. The thing about Jim was that he never seemed to be fighting the car. You watched some drivers and you could see the effort. Their hands were busy. The car moved underneath them. You could almost feel how hard they were working. With Jim, it was different. Everything seemed quiet. And yet the stopwatch kept telling you just how quick he was. We raced against one another during that period when Lotus was really beginning to change Formula One. In 1961, Jim was driving the works Lotus 21 while I was racing the older Lotus 18 for Rob Walker. At Monaco that year, I put the car on pole and won the race against those very powerful Ferraris. Jim was there in the newer works Lotus, although his race ended with a 10th place finish. Later that season at the Nürburgring, I won again, while Jim finished 4th. Now, if you only looked at those results, you might think there wasn't much reason for me to worry about him. But racing drivers don't judge one another only by where somebody finishes on Sunday. You notice how a man approaches a corner. You notice how much speed he carries without upsetting the car. You notice whether the same lap comes back again and again without mistakes. And Jim had that. What made him special wasn't aggression. It was precision. He could be tremendously quick without making the whole business look dramatic. That's a very difficult thing to do, because usually when a driver is close to the limit, you can see it. With Jim, the limit seemed to move. My career ended before we ever had the chance to develop the sort of rivalry people might have expected. I had my accident at Goodwood in 1962, and Jim went on to become the dominant driver many of us already suspected he could be. That's always been one of the interesting things for me. I raced against Fangio when he was already the standard everybody measured themselves against. With Jim, I saw the standard arriving, and I think that's sometimes even more impressive. You don't need 10 seasons beside a man to recognize real ability. Sometimes a few races are enough. Jim Clark was one of those drivers. Now, Jack Brabham was a very different kind of driver. What impressed me about Jack was that he understood the whole business of motor racing. Not just how to drive the car quickly, but how the car worked, how a race developed, and how to get to the finish when other men were using up everything they had. We were very different in that respect. I was always inclined to race whatever I had underneath me. If the car was good enough to attack, I wanted to attack. Jack could step back from that emotion. He could think about the race almost like an engineer while he was driving it. That made him extremely difficult. By 1959, the rear-engined Cooper had changed the picture completely. I was driving a Cooper for Rob Walker while Jack was with the Works Cooper team. At Monaco, he won his first World Championship Grand Prix. Later that year, he won the British Grand Prix at Aintree as well. I won in Portugal and Italy, so there were certainly weekends when I had the speed, but Jack kept collecting results, and that mattered. The championship eventually went to him. The following season showed that 1,959 had been no accident. Jack won 5 World Championship races in succession during 1960 and took his second title. By then, everybody understood what he and Cooper had helped prove. The old front-engined way of doing things was disappearing. What made Jack so difficult was never simply that he was quick. It was that he rarely seemed to waste anything. He understood machinery very well. He had come through Australian racing, working closely with cars himself, and you could see that technical understanding in Formula One. He knew what the car was doing underneath him. He could communicate that to the people around him, and he had the patience to think beyond one corner or even one lap. That is a tremendous weapon in a racing driver. There were men who could frighten you with one qualifying lap. Jack could frighten you over an entire season. You might beat him one Sunday and feel very pleased with yourself. Then you looked at the championship several races later and discovered that he had quietly put himself exactly where he needed to be. I respected that enormously. As drivers, we like to believe speed settles everything. When you're young, especially, you think if you're quicker than the other fellow, you've done your job. Jack was proof that it wasn't quite that simple. You had to understand the car. You had to understand the championship. And perhaps most importantly, you had to understand when not to take something from the machinery that it couldn't afford to give you. Jack understood all of that. That's why beating him in a race was satisfying. Beating him over a season was something else entirely. With Mike Hawthorn, things were different. Mike and I knew each other well enough to understand that once the visor came down, friendship didn't count for very much. He was aggressive, confident, and very hard to discourage. If he thought there was a chance to beat you, he would keep coming. What made Mike dangerous wasn't that he was always the quickest man on the circuit. He wasn't. The truth is, there were weekends when I had more outright speed. But Mike had something that mattered just as much over a championship season. He kept himself in the fight. And 1,958 proved it. That year, I won 4 World Championship Grand Prix. Mike won only 1 at Reims in France. But he kept finishing near the front, collecting points. And by the time we reached the final race in Morocco, the championship was still between us. He eventually beat me by 1 point. 42-41. But when people talk about Mike and me, they usually come back to Portugal. I won at Porto that year, and Mike finished second. Near the end of the race, he spun his Ferrari and became involved in an incident while getting the car back onto the circuit. The officials initially wanted to disqualify him. I had seen what happened, so I spoke on his behalf. As a result, Mike kept his second place and the points that went with it. Those points eventually became enormously important because of how close the championship finished. People have asked me many times whether I regretted doing that. No, I didn't, because there were certain things we believed about racing in those days. You tried to beat the other fellow on the circuit. You didn't want to beat him because the officials had misunderstood something you had seen clearly yourself. If telling the truth cost me a world championship, then so be it. Mike deserved his championship. He had stayed there all season. He had absorbed the pressure, kept scoring points, and when opportunities came, he took them. That's part of being a great racing driver too. And there was another side to 1,958 that people sometimes forget. It was a dreadful year for Ferrari. Mike lost teammates and friends, including Peter Collins at the Nürburgring. Yet he continued racing and carried that championship fight all the way to the end. I respected him for that. Motor racing teaches you very quickly that courage isn't only about braking late. Sometimes courage is simply getting back into the car when you know exactly what the consequences can be. Mike understood those consequences better than most of us by the end of 1958. And still, he finished the job. That's why when I think about Mike Hawthorn, I don't think first about the one point that separated us. I think about the man who was still there when the season was over. And then there was Alberto Ascari. Alberto belonged to a slightly earlier phase of my career, when I was still trying to prove that I could consistently belong with the very best Grand Prix drivers in Europe. By the time I was establishing myself properly, he was already the man everybody was watching. Ferrari was enormously strong in those years, of course, and Alberto had the machinery to win, but I never believed the car explained everything. What made him so difficult was the rhythm he could build. Some drivers attacked a race in bursts. You would see one extraordinary lap, then another that was slightly untidy. Alberto was different. Once he settled into a Grand Prix, he had this ability to repeat the same level of performance again and again. That wears you down as an opponent. You can tell yourself that you'll catch him when he makes a mistake. Then 5 laps pass, then 10, and the mistake doesn't come. In 1952 and 1953, he won the World Championship for Ferrari, and during that period, he became the standard for consistency at the front. He wasn't simply collecting victories because everybody else was falling apart. He was controlling races. I saw enough of him to understand how complete he was. The Nürburgring in 1953 is one of those races that comes back to me. That circuit demanded everything from a driver: courage, memory, concentration, mechanical sympathy. Alberto had already proved the year before what he could do there. And by 1953, everybody knew that if Ferrari and Ascari were functioning properly, beating them was a serious undertaking. What I admired most was that he didn't need to look spectacular to be devastatingly effective. That's something young drivers sometimes misunderstand. When you're starting out, you can become obsessed with appearing fast, big slides, late braking, throwing the car around, but the very best men often remove all of that unnecessary movement. They make speed look simple. Alberto could do that, and there was something else about racing him that stayed with me. He carried the expectations of Ferrari at a time when the team had become the dominant force in Grand Prix racing. That means pressure. Everybody expects you to win because they believe you have the best car. But having the best car creates its own burden. If you win, people say you were supposed to. If you lose, everybody asks what went wrong. Alberto handled that extremely well. His death in 1955 was a terrible shock. Motor racing lost drivers far too often in those days, but some losses affected the whole paddock differently. Alberto had already achieved so much, and yet you still felt there was more racing left in him. When I think of him now, I don't first remember the championships. I remember the standard he represented. He showed me that real speed didn't always need drama. Sometimes the most frightening opponent was simply the man who kept getting every lap right. And then, of course, there was Juan Manuel Fangio. I don't think I could talk about the greatest drivers I raced against without ending with him. Fangio was the man I measured myself against. By the time we became teammates at Mercedes in 1955, I already knew how good he was. Everybody did. But being near him every weekend taught me something different. You could watch a driver from the outside and think you understood him. Then you share a team with him and you see the details. That was when I realized just how complete Fangio was. He wasn't simply fast. He knew when to use the speed. That's a very different thing. What made him so difficult was that he understood the race as a whole. He could feel the condition of the car. He could manage the machinery. He could change his approach depending on what the race needed. And he had this extraordinary calmness about him. I was younger. I wanted to push I wanted to prove something. Fangio never seemed to need that. He already knew what he could do. And that confidence made him very hard to beat. The race people always ask me about is the 1955 British Grand Prix at Aintree. I won that day. Fangio finished just 0.2 of a second behind me. It was my first victory in a World Championship Grand Prix, and of course it meant a great deal to win at home in front of the British crowd. But for years afterward, people asked the same question. Did Fangio let me win? I asked myself that too. And I never really had a completely satisfying answer. Fangio always maintained that I had won the race properly. I wanted to believe him. But when the man behind you is Fangio and the gap at the finish is only a fraction of a second, you can understand why the thought never disappears entirely. What mattered more to me was what I learnt from being beside him that season. There were occasions when I could match him for speed. Sometimes I could even beat him. But over a championship, he had another level of judgment. He understood that every race didn't have to be won in the same way. Sometimes you attacked. Sometimes you waited. Sometimes you accepted second place because forcing the car harder would achieve nothing. That sounds obvious when you're older. It doesn't feel obvious when you're young and sitting in a racing car. Fangio taught me that, and I respected him enormously for it. He won 5 world championships, but that's not why I put him above almost everybody I raced. I was close enough to see the way he worked. The preparation, the discipline, the lack of unnecessary drama, and most of all, the intelligence behind the speed. There are drivers you remember because you beat them. There are drivers you remember because they beat you. Fangio was different. I remember him because every time I raced against him, I came away understanding motor racing a little better. You know, when you spend enough years in motor racing, you eventually realize that the trophies are only part of what stays with you. People remember the victories. They remember the championships. They remember the photographs of cars crossing the finish line. But as a driver, you remember different things. You remember looking into your mirrors and recognizing the helmet behind you. You remember knowing that one mistake would be enough. You remember the men who made you find something extra when you thought there was nothing left. I never became world champion. For many years people treated that as the great unfinished part of my career. Perhaps it was, but I had the privilege of racing against some extraordinary men. In an era when every Grand Prix asked a great deal from all of us, the cars changed. The circuits changed. And eventually Formula One moved on without us. That's the natural order of things. Records will always be broken, and another generation will always come along. But the men you raced wheel to wheel with never really leave you. After all these years, I can still remember exactly what it felt like when one of them appeared in my mirrors.